What's up, y'all? I want you to do a thought exercise with me. Pretend you just spent $15,000 on a huge advertising opportunity at a trade show. 15,000 bucks. And here's what that gets you. 16 seconds, no audio, on a large LCD screen in a hallway with heavy foot traffic. So what do you do with this opportunity? One option is a single static image with a call to action, a motion graphic listing out your differentiators. Most teams pick one of those two options because both of those are safe and nobody gets in trouble for picking safe, just like nobody got in trouble for picking IBM back in the day. But here's the thing about this scenario. If you go with one of those two tried and true options, it's a giant missed opportunity to expand how your team self-organizes around marketing challenges and how you guys show up out in the wild. If you want your brand showing up and being the one others are pointing to, you need to get on board with this concept I'm going to talk through. But I will warn you right now, this is going to make you and your team uncomfortable, but if you stick with it, I promise this will produce some huge results that your team will be really proud of. And you will occupy a lane in this industry that nobody else is really trying to do or can do very well. And that would be humor. And there's an actual process for getting good at introducing humor to the way that your brand shows up. Okay, and that's what this episode is going to be about. Now, if you're paying attention to what most prolific marketers are saying, you probably already know the theme. Content, podcasts, video, short form video, vlogs, everybody's telling you to show up and create. And that's great. And that advice isn't wrong. It's just kind of incomplete. And that's because most of what gets made under that advice in the banking and fintech world specifically basically all looks the same. Safe, buttoned up, really like not closing any distance with the people that are watching it. So humor, in my opinion, is one of the most wide open lanes in this entire industry. And really like nobody's even fighting for it because it's not really the way that it's done, which is a giant mistake. And I think a lot of this comes from the origins of banking, which it's really all about being conservative, playing it safe. You're working with other people's money. So, there's a tremendous element of trust. And so those concepts have really permeated through to how we talk about what we do in the market. And so as we talk about leaning into humor and trying to find a way to be able to at times crack a joke with the way you talk about the market, the industry, your solutions. The biggest risk here is never developing the ability to do it and never exposing your team to the thought exercise that gets you there and develops those capabilities. People will say, we don't really try to go there because humor is so subjective. I mean, like, what if it doesn't land and all of a sudden we're in the news? But again, the real risk here is playing it safe. Safe doesn't fail loud. Safe fails quietly, right? Nobody remembers it. Your $15,000 that you spent for the advertising segment is, basically wasted. You should have just saved your $15,000 and not even advertised. Sometimes, even if a joke misses, it's at least going to get a reaction. Safe doesn't even get that. It's completely ignored. And so invisibility is the real failure here, not a little comedic gaffe. Of course, there's exceptions to everything here. And, like the world as I get older, I realize is not black and white. It is very gray. And being able to exist within that kind of gray area is a real skill that you develop over time. And that's really what I'm trying to get us to here. And so comedy is like a superpower if you can wield it correctly. And if you're still not convinced, check out this quote from Victor Borge. Laughter is the shortest distance between two people. I totally believe that. I'm sure anybody listening to this has seen that manifest in real life in all sorts of ways. And it's really never been more true than right now or more ignored in fintech marketing. And so here's what's really changed recently. That lane isn't just open, it's getting easier to lean into it. And AI just took a huge chunk of the cost and complexity out of trying it. You don't need a production budget or a full studio to test a comedy bit anymore. You need a team with the green light from senior leadership to riff on these ideas and the guts to publish it. And I'm going to talk about a project that we recently did where we were leading a project for a fintech brand. And there were times in which it was uncomfortable and people weren't agreeing on things. And that's totally okay. But we'll get more into that here in a little bit. But I want to be clear about something. So humor shouldn't be your de facto way of presenting and exposing your brand. I'm not saying that. It's not meant to replace your voice, but it is a muscle and a skill that I think any good marketer or brand should have in the toolkit so they're ready for moments that call for it and learning how to spot these moments. Cheeky, bold, contrarian, dry, absurd, whatever. Pick a flavor and practice it. So, most don't nail their first joke. That's exactly why so few brands ever really get good at this. One flop or, limited response from the market, and often the experiment is over. And this is why the brands that stick with it end up basically owning that lane. Think of Will and Truss and all of their funny commercials. If you haven't seen them, you've got to check them out. They are fantastic. And they've taken a really serious topic, dying and, what happens with your family and your assets, right? And they've been able to make it very funny. But here's kind of the harder truth about this experiment, developing skills around comedy. Getting support for this inside an organization is probably the hardest part of the entire thing. Everybody's busy, and what the company's been doing before has been more or less fine. But the thing I notice when I look around is that their content's never really been awesome. Sure, it looks polished, but it looks like pretty much everyone else's. So it's forgettable. So here's my thought on it. Ideation and the creative process around humor really runs on trust. You know what else does? Innovation. And both innovation and creative, compelling, funny content require serious amounts of trust from senior leaders. Your team really needs the ability to swing for the fences and get funky and weird at times in the writer's room. And if you do try to launch one of these comedic initiatives and it doesn't land, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. But there's definitely a trap that people fall into when they go down this path. When something experimental doesn't land right away, companies often run back to their comfort zone and get back to basics. So if you're a leader and you're dealing with a scenario where your team tried it and it didn't really land, your job is to dust off the folks who swung and missed so that they can take another swing and they can keep working toward this. In my opinion, this is the hardest skill to develop as a marketing professional. So if you want to lean into this concept we're talking about, right, building skill sets around comedic content, let's talk about tactics, right? How we pull this off. I'm going to break it down into three things. First, time box a goal that will force you into this exercise. Look at where you're showing up in the next 6 months. Could be trade shows, ads, webinars, a new product launch. One of these, I'll call them theaters, is going to be where you're going to drop your first piece of experimental content. Doesn't need to be a whole campaign. It just needs to be a place for it to live. Okay. Second, creating the room to riff on the idea. This is the part everybody, I think, skips. So you need a space where somebody can say, okay, I have a really stupid idea, but just let me get to the end and hear me out and don't immediately dismiss it. And people actually listen to that. And the person can flesh out the idea. Think about it like this. Pretend you're like the writers of an episode of The Simpsons back in the day, all hanging out and throwing things against the wall. This is what your team needs to be doing. And culturally, this is really going to differ from org to org and could totally be the off-ramp for bringing in a third party with the creative jumper cables to get things started. And third, and this one might matter the most, protect the initiative. Here's what happens in most companies when they try to go down this path. They can't stick the landing on the comedy. They can't kind of find their way to the finish line. And instead of saying, all right, let's double down, let's keep digging in on doing this, it's important, the initiative gets buried in Area 51, like in Indiana Jones, never to be spoken of again, back to tried and true, safe content. And, the next time somebody pitches something bold, everybody remembers what happened last time, and that's it. Now, I want to talk about a real scenario, the scenario I mentioned earlier that our team encountered in this regard. So a client of ours landed a pretty awesome placement at a huge conference, and it cost $15,000 for 16 seconds of screen time, no audio allowed on an LCD screen. And we need people to stop in their tracks, look at the video, scan the QR code, remember the brand. Those are really like the two goals of the ad here. So what do you do in this scenario? In full transparency, the first idea in the room was a static image with a call to action. Then we moved on to a motion graphic, listing out the differentiators. It's professional, normal, exactly the kind of thing nobody ever really gets in trouble for. But it's also the thing nobody remembers, right? And the size of the ad's price tag became the argument against playing it safe. And that was the moment we decided to swing for the fences. So the idea we landed on was a ridiculous and silly concept. And if you want to see it, you can pull it up in the show notes of this episode. When you do, you'll see that the first half of the video was built with AI. And what's crazy is if we would have shot the scene in real life, it would have run somewhere in the ballpark of probably $50,000. A lighting guy, sound engineer, the setting, the videographer, actors, extras, extra takes, so on and so forth. So more than 3 times the media spend itself. Now let's talk about the pushback you will encounter when you try to lead your team down a weird, goofy, and maybe silly path on the creative front. People are going to ask very fair questions. What does this actually mean? Well, how does this tie into our product? These are fair questions and totally make sense, but it's important to remember that we can communicate effectively even through abstract means. Now, to be honest with you, this is where having developed taste in this exercise is going to provide a lot of clarity for your team. And it's for this reason that more reps with this exercise will help big time. In our case, we cared more about tastefully grabbing the attention of eyeballs walking down the hallway and making them invested enough to watch the tail end of our ad, which was really more of what they're used to seeing, value propositions, differentiators, etc. But here's the part I really want you to hear. As the deadline got close, we actually killed the fun idea we were developing. We pivoted to something safer, more literal, more kind of what I would call a selling vibe, the version that answers the question of, what does this have to do with our product more clearly? And then almost on a whim, our team put together a rough mock-up of the original wacky idea. We didn't want to let it die yet. And we ran an informal test and showed it to a handful of bankers and fintech executives alongside the safer version and asked, which one do you like more? Well, the abstract version won by a landslide. Everybody preferred that one. And the exact audience this was built for, bankers and fintech execs, gravitated toward the thing that made them stop and crack a smile. And with the deadline closing in, the team pivoted back to the original idea, polished the abstract concept, and we ended up shipping it. And everyone ended up genuinely happy with where it landed. And I have to give credit to our client because they were adamant that they didn't like the idea. But when their ICP liked it and we had objective proof that our intended audience liked it, there was no pride in the way. We all just executed. It was awesome. So here's my ask. Pick one project this quarter that makes the room a little uncomfortable. Not a full rebrand, just one project, one video, one pager, an ad, whatever. Get your team to start building the skills to do little brand experiments and find opportunities to off-road a bit. If you want to bring in some talent to help get the process going, Propagate Fintech would love to help. Thanks for listening to this episode. Hope it helps.